What if the most intimate act of life, birth itself, was never your own, but a calculation on someone else's ledger? What if your first cry was not heard as a child's voice, but recorded as increase in an account book? For millions, this was not a question, but a reality. Welcome to Gothic Ledger. Tonight, we open a case where history and genetics collide, where the silence of burned records meets the cold certainty of DNA. It is the story of how forced reproduction was engineered as policy, how cradles replaced slave ships, and how the evidence still lingers, carried quietly in bloodlines across continents. You will hear of ledgers that reduced infants to arithmetic, letters where statesmen praised childbirth as profitable, and advertisements that boasted a woman was breeding fast. You will see how overseers, physicians, and auctioneers turned wombs into machinery, and how modern science, through the skew of the X chromosome, confirms what those ledgers tried to disguise. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Write it down in the comments below, and if you find yourself drawn into these stories of hidden history, I ask that you like this video and subscribe to Gothic Ledger, so you never miss the echoes of the past that still haunt the present. Because this story is not only about what was done, it is about what was concealed and what remains unfinished. Archives end with blank lines. Genomes end with error bars. Between them lies a truth that resists silence, a truth written in both ink and blood. Let us begin. A ledger records infants not by name, but as increase. It is a word stripped of softness, a word that belongs to cattle tallies and bushels of corn. Yet in countless plantation books, that term appears with mechanical regularity. To the enslaver, each newborn was not a life, but a line of arithmetic, an addition to capital, a number that swelled the column of profit. In this way, the cries of children were converted into ink, their humanity erased into inventory. The legal framework that permitted this was cold in its precision. Partus sequitur ventrum. The condition of the child followed the condition of the mother, a Latin phrase that turned wombs into perpetual instruments of bondage. If the mother was enslaved, so too was her child, regardless of paternity. The child was property before it was a person, destined from its first breath to be listed in accounts. Each cry heard in the quarters became, in the master's study, a figure in a balance sheet. Surviving ledgers show this process with chilling clarity. Alongside notes of cotton picked and hogs slaughtered appear entries such as increase 2. No names, no acknowledgement of the women who bore them, nor of the flesh and blood struggle of labor. The entry is sterile, bureaucratic, yet behind it was a body torn in pain, a mother clutching an infant, and the trembling breath of life that was never considered her own. Economically, such births were as valuable as harvest. In some regions, enslaved women of childbearing age commanded higher prices precisely for their capacity to increase a master's estate. An infant once weaned could be appraised, mortgaged, or sold. Each birth thus represented not merely continuity, but expansion. The plantation reproduced itself biologically when imports could no longer be relied upon. The womb replaced the ship as the engine of supply. What lingers in the records is not just the erasure of individuality, but the chilling normalcy with which it was done. An overseer, noting increase, may have thought himself efficient, even diligent. A planter, reviewing accounts, saw in those entries the steady growth of wealth. Nowhere do the ledgers reveal the mother's grief at losing a child to sale, nor the fear of a girl who knew her own body was already bound in the arithmetic of others. It was here, in ink and in law, that the system revealed its most insidious logic. The enslaved were not only laborers, but also vessels of future labor. Motherhood became production, childbirth became capital, and infants became proof of the system's self-sustaining design. The ledger does not waver, does not hesitate. It records with calm exactitude what was in truth a theft of life renewed each generation. To read those lines today is to confront the distance between what the page claims and what the body endured. A column of increase is not a number. It is a cry that was never heard in freedom. It is the transformation of flesh into arithmetic, and it is the foundation upon which the machinery of forced reproduction was built. Among the papers of the early republic lies a sentence as polished as it is grotesque. An enslaver's letter coolly compares childbirth to crop yield. The phrasing is calm, aristocratic, almost indifferent. Yet beneath the varnished language is an arithmetic of flesh, where women's bodies were appraised in the same breath as wheat fields and tobacco rows. In the world of elite planters, correspondence often revealed not intimacy or sentiment, but a chilling calculation of how the next generation would secure profit. Thomas Jefferson, in his private reflections, described the births of enslaved children as more profitable than the best man on the farm. It was not rhetoric, but record. He spoke not of joy, not of humanity, but of advantage. For him, the expansion of wealth did not rely solely upon land or trade, but upon wombs made fertile by coercion. Such letters are haunting not for their passion, but for their absence of it. A great statesman's pen reduces human reproduction to balance sheet logic, revealing how deeply the institution of slavery entwined itself with the supposed virtues of order and reason. Other planters followed the same pattern. In letters to kin and business partners, childbirth was reported alongside crop conditions and market prices. A child was another unit of value, a guarantee of future labor, and a hedge against uncertainty in the markets. Phrases such as, "The wench has brought another fine boy," appear with the same cadence as notes on harvest or rainfall. It is in this routine, this chilling casualness, that the depth of normalization is exposed. What should have been an intimate event became a transaction carried out in the language of management. The grotesque quality lies not only in the content of these letters, but in their refinement. Written in the polished hand of the planter class, sealed with the wax of family crests, they carve the tone of civility. Yet they speak of forced reproduction as though it were a clever investment, a strategy no less legitimate than crop rotation. The mask of aristocratic calm only deepens the horror, for it shows how violence thrives when dressed in reason and dignity. To the enslaver, a child's cry was a sign of growth in estate value. To the historian, it is evidence of a system that consumed family itself, turning motherhood into dividend. The words preserved in these letters are not mere opinions. They are policy written in ink, shaping how plantations were managed, how marriages were denied, how bodies were pressed into cycles of endless utility. When read today, these letters reveal more than the thoughts of individuals. They reveal a culture that found no contradiction in treating childbirth as yield, that folded the most intimate of human experiences into the cold mechanics of business. The polished correspondence of the elite becomes its own form of indictment, proof that reproductive exploitation was not hidden in shadows, but announced, rationalized, and circulated among men who considered themselves civilized. In the end, these documents show the terrifying efficiency of normalization. When childbirth could be spoken of with the same calm as a good harvest, the system no longer needed to shout its violence. It whispered it, elegantly, in the very letters that shaped a nation. In the columns of 19th-century newspapers, commerce spoke with chilling simplicity. One advertisement, without hesitation, boasts that a woman is breeding fast. The phrase appears in the same ink and type as offers for horses, wagons, or land. Its bluntness is not accidental. It is the grammar of a market where fertility itself had a price. To read such lines today is to feel the casual cruelty of a world that transformed pregnancy into a selling point and the human womb into an investment opportunity. These notices circulated widely. In auction listings, women were described by age, complexion, health, and most disturbingly, by reproductive record. Phrases such as likely breeder, good stock, and childbearing wench appear with matter-of-fact precision. The language strips away individuality, replacing names with capacities, lives with functions. Just as a buyer might inquire about the yield of a field, he could weigh the promise of children yet unborn when determining a woman's value. At public sales, auctioneers often recited these attributes aloud, their voices echoing through crowded rooms where buyers calculated profit against suffering. The body of the woman was appraised not only for labor in the present, but for labor she might involuntarily deliver in the future. An enslaved mother was thus reduced to a dual ledger entry, her own strength and the projected strength of children she had not yet conceived. What is most chilling is the banality of it. These ads did not attempt disguise. Fertility was not a whispered fact, but a printed headline, available for all to see in town gazettes. Neighbors read them over breakfast. Traders clipped and carried them to markets. The commerce of reproduction was not hidden in shadows. It was openly traded in daylight, its language normalized through repetition until its grotesqueness became almost invisible. In the financial calculus of slavery, the pregnant body was a multiplier. A woman advertised as breeding fast promised a steady yield of additional enslaved laborers, each of whom could be sold, mortgaged, or inherited. The phrase turned the intimate and violent act of childbirth into a guarantee of return, reducing motherhood to a forecast of productivity. To the modern reader, these words stand as evidence not of isolated cruelty but of systemic design. The printed page does not lie. Entire markets functioned upon the commodification of fertility. Auctions required such language, and newspapers disseminated it, embedding reproductive exploitation into the very rhythm of commerce. What lingers is the ordinariness. The ad boasting of a woman breeding fast sits between notices of land sales and furniture auctions. It is presented without pause, as though the sale of future generations was no different from the sale of timber or tools. That placement, that normalization, is perhaps the most damning record of all. These advertisements remain today not merely as scraps of paper, but as testimony. They show how a society could erase personhood with a phrase, could present motherhood as commodity, and could market human life as yield. The ad's casual boast, still legible centuries later, speaks with an unbroken voice, that fertility was once sold as profit, and women were priced for the children their bodies could be forced to bear. When the Atlantic slave trade closed, the womb was forced to open wider. In 1808, Congress enacted the federal ban that ended the legal importation of captives from Africa. Ships that had once carried chained bodies across the ocean were silenced by law, their holds empty, their voyages cut short. But the silence of ships did not mark an end to bondage. It marked a redirection. Deprived of foreign supply, enslavers turned inward, converting the reproduction of enslaved women into the new foundation of profit. The nursery replaced the ship as the central artery of the trade. The economics were unambiguous. Demand for labor continued to grow across the expanding cotton frontier from Georgia to Mississippi and beyond. With imports cut off, planters relied on natural increase, a euphemism that hid coercion beneath its biological inevitability. The result was a surge in value for women of childbearing age and for the infants they produced. Ledgers began recording newborns with greater attention. Advertisements highlighted fertility as a premium trait. The arithmetic of birth became the most reliable means of securing future labor. Prices reveal the shift. Children, once considered of limited immediate value, rose sharply in worth. A boy barely old enough to walk became a commodity that could be mortgaged, insured, or sold into distant markets when he reached working age. Mothers, accordingly, were appraised not only for their ability to work, but for the potential of expanding an enslaver's estate through repeated pregnancies. The womb became, in effect, a new shipping lane, one that required no sails, no harbours, only bodies bound in law and overseers bound in duty to enforce it. The domestic slave trade flourished in this context. New Orleans became the great hub where families, often torn from Virginia and Maryland, were sold to satisfy the demand of the Deep South, the vasseurs. Children born in the Upper South were transported, sometimes before adolescence, to cotton and sugar plantations. Each child represented both the success of the new reproductive strategy and the fracturing of kinship bonds. The cradle in one region was the coffle in another. What makes the 1808 shift so chilling is its smoothness. The end of the international trade, often celebrated in national rhetoric, did not weaken the institution of slavery. It fortified it, embedding it deeper into the domestic fabric. Women's reproductive capacities became more than incidental. They became central. The labor of the future was planned not in ports but in bedrooms, not in harbors but in the enforced intimacies of the quarters. The silence of ships was replaced by the sound of cradles, yet even those cradles were not symbols of family but of capital. The cries of infants were, for enslavers, signals of continuity, of assets secured against the uncertainties of markets and the volatility of crops. Each newborn was a dividend, proof that the system could reproduce itself without foreign supply. Thus, the year 1808 stands not as a victory, but as a pivot. A law that appeared to curtail slavery, instead, redirected its violence inward, binding women's bodies more tightly to the machinery of profit. In the absence of ships, the womb carried the weight of an empire's demand. Midwives, doctors, and overseers monitored cycles like harvest schedules. On many plantations, reproduction was tracked with the same cold vigilance given to fields of cotton or tobacco. The body of the enslaved woman was not regarded as her own, but as a mechanism of production, observed and managed to ensure its output. What should have been private rhythms of life were instead treated as measurable intervals, charted for profit. Records from plantations describe overseers noting the timing of menstruation, pregnancies, and births. Women of childbearing age were watched closely, their bodies scrutinized not for health in the humane sense, but for fertility in the economic one. Midwives, often themselves enslaved, were pressed into service under this coercive system. Their knowledge of birth and care, once grounded in community, was conscripted into the arithmetic of forced reproduction. Under the eye of white physicians, their practices became an instrument of surveillance rather than solidarity. Pregnancy was not a respite from labor, but another stage of management. Plantation regimens dictated diet, workload, and even posture for pregnant women, framed as protection, but designed to secure a living infant for the estate. Prenatal care was less about compassion than calculation. If a woman miscarried, it represented a financial loss. If she carried to term, her body had successfully fulfilled its assigned function. Every breath of a mother was a balance between survival and yield. Some planters employed physicians to oversee multiple plantations, giving medical reports on the progress of pregnancies alongside livestock conditions. Letters describe women ready for confinement, as though it were an inventory update, the expected delivery date listed like a harvest. Even the moments of labor were not shielded from intrusion. Overseers waited for the cry of a child as this. I would await the clatter of a threshed crop. The presence of midwives adds a further layer of unease. Skilled in traditions of healing, they often served their communities in secret acts of resistance, but within the plantation order, their role was twisted. They were compelled to report pregnancies, to assist in deliveries that would feed the market, and to watch helplessly as infants were claimed by owners before mothers could bond. Their hands, steady in labor, carried the weight of both care and complicity, caught between duty to their people and commands from their masters. What emerges from these practices is not medicine in its true sense, but medicine re-engineered as management. Doctors and overseers treated the body as machinery, a womb to be maintained, cycles to be timed, infants to be delivered as output. The woman herself disappeared beneath this framework, her suffering reduced to an impediment, her health to a means. The plantation thus blurred the line between clinic and counting house. Medical knowledge became another tool of domination, ensuring that pregnancies were not chance, but policy, not nature, but design. The body was surveilled, regimented, and broken into intervals of profitability. And in the end, the cry of a newborn was not first heard as a mother's triumph, but as the plantation's return on investment. In New Orleans, women's bodies were inspected for signs of fertility. The auction block, polished by countless feet, was not only a stage for laborers and artisans, but for mothers yet unborn. Buyers stepped forward with the scrutiny of livestock judges, their eyes trained to detect the features of a body that could produce more bodies. The market floor was a theater of humiliation where fertility itself became a visible, tradable commodity. The process was clinical in its cruelty. Women were instructed to stand upright, arms at their sides, while men circled them like appraisers of flesh. Teeth were examined to estimate age, hips and pelvis measured with the gaze, and breasts considered as signs of previous childbirth. The body was stripped of its privacy, converted into evidence of reproductive potential. Auctioneers announced not simply able-bodied woman, but young wench proven breeder, inviting bids that reflected not just the present, but the imagined future generations she might bear. New Orleans, the hub of the domestic slave trade, was notorious for this practice. Families brought from Virginia or Maryland found themselves funneled through warehouses where inspectors recorded health, childbearing history, and even temperament. Pregnant women were often advertised as doubly valuable, a worker now, with another already forming within. Children clinging to their mothers were displayed as living proof of fertility, their very presence strengthening the seller's pitch. Behind the spectacle was a mathematics of profit. A woman of 20, healthy and without children, promised decades of forced labor and years of reproduction ahead. A woman with children at her side proved her capacity, guaranteeing that investment would multiply. These details were not whispered. They were proclaimed in open markets, inscribed on broadsheets, circulated through networks of buyers. Ho understood the arithmetic. The atmosphere was at once public and detached. Crowds stood as though attending a fair, yet what they witnessed was the measurement of human futures. To the buyers, hips suggested the strength of childbirth, teeth suggested longevity, and scars suggested a history of resistance or punishment. Each feature became a line in an unspoken catalogue, reducing a life to traits, a mother to machinery. The humiliation lay in the exposure. Women stripped of autonomy were made to display the intimate markers of their bodies to strangers whose only aim was profit. The maternal bond was weaponized as evidence, the presence of children beside them transformed from love into commodity. The cries of infants at these markets were not regarded as voices, but as signals, confirming the capacity of their mothers to reproduce. For the enslavers, the market was efficient, a place where value could be announced and confirmed in public. For the women on the block, It was the moment when the most intimate parts of themselves, their bodies, their fertility, their children, were put on display as tradable assets. The market floor became a crucible where motherhood was not honored but auctioned, and where reproductive value was assessed with the same detached eye that judged cattle or mules. In these sales rooms, commerce declared openly what the plantation enforced in silence, that the enslaved woman's body was not hers to keep, but a ledger of potential, to be inspected, priced, and sold. Jamaican estates recorded pregnancy as policy, not chance. In the ledgers of the Caribbean, childbirth was not an accidental occurrence, but an anticipated outcome, managed through rules and enforced routines. The empire's plantations, vast and profitable, functioned as laboratories of control, where maternity itself was written into the laws of production. Estate regulations survive in fragments, and their tone is bureaucratic, almost administrative. Pregnant women were sometimes allotted additional rations of salted fish or cassava flour, not as gestures of kindness, but as calculated investments to secure a live birth. Work schedules were adjusted only marginally, and often late in pregnancy, ensuring that labor continued until the last possible moment. Instructions to overseers detailed how much work could be extracted without threatening the child, balancing the risk of miscarriage against the loss of potential profit. Such policies reveal an unsettling symmetry. The empire's interest in maternal survival was never separate from economic calculation. A mother who lived through childbirth and raised a surviving infant strengthened the plantation's long-term viability. Infant mortality, therefore, was tracked as carefully as crop yield. The cry of a newborn was measured not as joy, but as productivity fulfilled. If an infant died, it was recorded as a failed return, a lost investment in the arithmetic of empire. In Jamaica, this calculus was sharpened by demographic realities. With imports from Africa gradually restricted in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, planters sought to secure self-sustaining populations. Fertility and survival were woven into policy. Enslaved women were expected to bear children not for themselves, but for the estate. The language of breeding programs, though crude, captures the reality. Reproduction was coerced, regulated, and monitored with the same rigor as the cultivation of sugarcane. The empire's reach extended beyond overseers. Colonial officials and physicians weighed in, offering advice on how to reduce infant mortality or how best to manage expectant mothers. Reports sent back to Britain described improvements in natural increase as though they were experiments yielding promising results. The plantation was not only a site of economic exploitation, but of systemic reproductive control, justified and codified under the banner of imperial management. For the women themselves, maternity became a contested terrain. Pregnancy offered no guarantee of respite. Instead, it placed them under heightened scrutiny. Their bodies were policed not only for their labor, but for the future lives they carried. They were provisioned when it served the estate, punished when deemed negligent, and measured by outcomes over which they had little control. The Caribbean estates thus transformed the intimate cycles of conception and birth into instruments of empire. The laws of the womb became extensions of colonial law, codified through ration charts, labor schedules, and survival tallies. A child was less a member of a family than a line in the empire's ledger. What lingers in these records is the clarity of intent. Pregnancy was never left to chance. It was governed as policy. In the shadow of cane fields and boiling houses, the empire's arithmetic extended into the very bodies of women, binding their survival and their children's survival to the productivity of the plantation. The term wench encoded perpetual sexual availability. In plantation ledgers and auction broadsheets, the word appears with deceptive simplicity, Yet behind it lies an entire structure of domination. A wench was not simply a woman. It was a label that collapsed identity into use. It implied youth, fertility, and an ever-present readiness for labor and for violation. To speak the word was to erase individuality and inscribe a body into a role of permanent subjugation. Language in this system was never neutral. Words themselves became instruments of control, carrying meanings designed to normalize coercion. Auction records describe breeding women, a phrase that transforms the intimate act of motherhood into a calculated utility. In these advertisements, fertility is presented as a feature, no different than strength of arm or skill in a trade. The language erases consent, erases selfhood, and leaves only capacity, as if the woman herself were little more than an animal marked for stock improvement. Other euphemisms served the same function. A likely girl often indicated not only youth, but also the prospect of many future births. Sound suggested health, but also reproductive promise. The banality of these terms concealed their violence. They allowed buyers to discuss flesh and fertility in the clipped professional tone of commerce. What could not be spoken openly, the systematic coercion of women, was rendered acceptable through coded vocabulary. The power of such words extended beyond the marketplace. They shaped perception within the plantation world, teaching generations to view enslaved women not as kin or companions, but as resources. An overseer referring to a woman as a wench did more than insult her. He positioned her within a hierarchy that denied her humanity and permitted her exploitation. Language both described and enforced reality. The words "alas" inflicted a subtler violence. To hear oneself called breeding stock was to be reminded daily of one's enforced role. These labels became chains no less binding than iron. They followed women through quarters and fields, whispered in markets, written in ledgers, repeated in conversations among men who never saw contradiction between their civility and their commerce. Even in private letters, where sentiment might have emerged, the vocabulary persisted. Planters spoke of their girls as if they were property no different from barns or tools. A girl could be 30 years old, a mother of several children, yet the diminutive reinforced her position as subordinate, controllable, forever dependent. These terms, so ordinary on the page, reveal the depth to which language codified subjugation. Today, the survival of these words in documents is both evidence and indictment. They show how domination was sustained not only by chains and laws, but by the very syllables men chose to write and speak. Each term carried with it a worldview that normalized coercion and commodification until exploitation seemed as natural as the words themselves. The vocabulary of slavery was more than description. It was policy, it was ideology, and it was a weapon. To call a woman a wench was to claim her body. To call her a breeding woman was to reduce her to a womb in service of profit. And once the words were spoken, the system did not need explanation. The language itself carried the command. The X chromosome remembers differently than the rest of the genome. In its quiet arithmetic lies a haunting discrepancy. When geneticists compare ancestry across chromosomes, the X carries fewer traces of European heritage than the autosomes. The imbalance is not random. It is the echo of a pattern repeated countless times, where European men contributed disproportionately to the lineage of enslaved populations, and African women bore the burden of carrying those lineages forward. This is what geneticists call sex-biased admixture. In studies across African American populations, the autosomes, those chromosomes inherited equally from both parents, show a higher proportion of European ancestry. The X chromosome, transmitted more often through women, shows markedly less. The difference reveals a systemic asymmetry. European men, often enslavers or those in positions of power, imposed themselves upon African women, while African men were largely excluded from this reproductive equation by force. Numbers here do not embellish, they indict. One large-scale analysis revealed that in many African American communities, European male contribution accounted for nearly all of the European ancestry observed. African female contribution dominated the maternal line. These results do not come with names, but they align with what plantation records whispered. Enslaved women were coerced, their children born into bondage under the law of partus sequitur ventrum. What makes this evidence chilling is its detachment. The genome does not dramatize, it does not weep. It produces ratios, probabilities, confidence intervals. Yet within those sterile figures lies the imprint of violence repeated across generations. Every percentage point of skew is a record of coercion made permanent in blood. The data confirms what ledgers implied but often obscured, where auction advertisements hinted at breeding women, and overseers recorded increase without detail. The genome fills in the structural pattern. It reveals that the asymmetry was not anecdotal but systemic, written into the reproductive history of millions. The very molecules of inheritance bear witness to what was normalized on the auction block and whispered in correspondence. And yet, the genome speaks with a different voice than the archive. It cannot name the women who bore these children, nor identify the men who forced themselves upon them. It cannot recover the cries of infants or the silence of those who resisted. It can only sketch the pattern in broad strokes, exposing an imbalance too vast to ignore. Where the archive is incomplete, the genome is impartial. Its testimony statistical, but no less damning. The science of skew shows that exploitation did not vanish with the destruction of records. It survives in the ratios of chromosomes preserved across time. What a ledger reduced to increase, the genome renders as uneven percentages of ancestry. Two languages, centuries apart, describing the same violence, one in ink, one in DNA. In this way, the genome becomes its own archive. It remembers what was denied, confirms what was hidden, and preserves what no overseer ever intended to record. The skew of the X chromosome is not merely a genetic curiosity. It is the biological residue of a system that turned reproduction into a weapon of profit. In thousands of genomes, the same imbalance appears. The figures, detached and clinical, show a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. European male ancestry is disproportionately present, while African female ancestry dominates the maternal line. This imbalance is not isolated to a single family or region. It echoes across the United States, the Caribbean, and Latin America, repeating like a refrain etched into bloodlines. The averages tell the story with cold precision. Among African Americans, genetic studies reveal roughly 20% European ancestry on average. Yet when separated by chromosome, the disparity sharpens. Autosomes carry more European markers, while the X chromosome carries less. The numbers confirm that European men contributed to the lineage at a far higher rate than European women, a pattern entirely consistent with systemic sexual exploitation under slavery. Regional differences deepen the picture. In the American South, where cotton and sugar expanded through the 19th century, the skew is especially pronounced. Populations in Louisiana and South Carolina show European male ancestry, contributing as much as a third of the genetic profile, while the maternal lines remain overwhelmingly African. In the Caribbean, where mortality on sugar plantations was higher, the imbalance reflects cycles of forced reproduction that attempted to stabilize populations once the transatlantic trade declined. In parts of Latin America, particularly Brazil, the pattern takes yet another form. Higher levels of admixture overall, but still the unmistakable asymmetry of male European and female African ancestry. What emerges from these findings is a statistical inevitability. The same imbalance repeated in population after population mirrors the systems described in plantation records and economic ledgers, where documents used phrases like increase and breed. Aing woman. The genome shows the result, an enduring legacy of coercion mapped in molecular ratios. The figures do not embellish, they confirm. The haunting quality lies in the scale. Each genome, taken alone, reveals little, but when thousands are examined together, the imbalance becomes a collective record, a pattern of violation rendered visible in numbers. It is as though the genome carries its own census, a survey of histories too intimate and too violent to have been preserved in traditional archives. The echo does not fade, it multiplies with every dataset, every study, every chart. And yet the genome's clarity is matched by its silence. It tells us what happened across populations, but not to whom. It cannot restore names erased from ledgers, nor identify the fathers absent from records. The numbers are precise but impersonal, offering patterns without stories. The archive and the genome meet in this haunting intersection. One reduced lives to inventory, the other reduces them to statistics. Between them lies the truth of systemic exploitation. The patterns across a population confirm what enslavers never needed to admit openly. Coercion was not incidental. It was structural, repeated until it became inscribed in inheritance itself. To read these genomes today is to see history carried forward, written not in ink or memory, but in the quiet, statistical pulse of blood. Genes trace routes from West Africa to Carolina fields and Caribbean ports. Where ships once crossed the Atlantic, genomes now map their spectral aftermath. The same paths marked on shipping ledgers and port records have left their imprint in bloodlines, invisible to the eye, yet unmistakable in genetic code. What the Middle Passage carried in chains, the present still carries in inheritance. Modern studies align ancestry markers with geography, and the results are precise. Populations in South Carolina and Georgia, long dominated by rice plantations, retain strong connections to the coastal regions of Sierra Leone and Senegambia. Louisiana, shaped by French colonial trade, shows greater input from Bight of Benin and Congo lineages. In the Caribbean, where mortality was extreme and replacement constant, genetic diversity reveals the relentless cycling of captives through ports like Kingston and Bridgetown. Each region reflects the shipping lanes that supplied its labor. The genome does more than show origins, it measures time. Admixture dating reveals pulses of genetic mixing concentrated in the 18th and early 19th centuries, coinciding exactly with the height of the transatlantic trade and the expansion of plantation economies. These pulses are not vague shadows. They are signatures of violence occurring with such regularity that they can be plotted on a timeline. Every spike is a reminder of bodies forced together under coercion, of unions not chosen but compelled. The geographic variation mirrors labor regimes. In sugar islands like Jamaica, where death rates outpaced birth rates, genetic evidence shows repeated influxes from Africa well into the 19th century. In the United States, where after 1808 the trade was legally closed, the genetic record reveals fewer fresh African inputs, and instead greater reliance on internal reproduction. The genome thus captures both the shipping lanes that fed the Caribbean and the coerced nurseries that sustained the American South. Maritime echoes linger in these findings. The slave ship, a vessel of commerce and horror, has left no survivors' voices intact, yet the genome still carries its wake. The routes drawn across nautical charts are reflected in allele frequencies, the invisible coordinates of blood. What began in ports like Luanda or Elmina did not end upon disembarkation. It was etched into the very code of those carried across. To the detached eye of science, these routes appear as clusters of data points, as maps shaded in gradients of probability. But behind them lies the silent procession of coffles, the cries in ship holds, the forced disembarkations at Caribbean quays and southern wharves. The genetic record is at once spectral and material. Spectral because it does not name individuals, material because it confirms the weight of their journeys. The roots written in blood reveal a truth that archives alone could not sustain. Documents can be lost, names can be erased, ships can vanish from record, but the genome remains. It is a map carried inside the body, one that mirrors the shipping lanes of empire and the labor regimes of colonies. What was charted on ocean currents is still charted today in inheritance. Fathers rarely named, mothers reduced to wenches. In the surviving records of slavery, absence speaks as loudly as presence. The ledgers are filled with numbers, with prices, with cold descriptions of flesh. Yet when the question of parentage arises, silence falls. Where the name of a father should appear, there is only a blank space, a dash, or nothing at all. Where the identity of a mother might have been recorded, the term is often generic, wench, girl, or simply female. These omissions are not accidents of poor record-keeping. They are the deliberate erasures of a system that relied on obscurity to mask its violence. Plantation archives are thick with details of crops and weather, debts and credits, yet the most intimate of facts, the identity of those who fathered children, rarely surface. This absence shields perpetrators. The men who forced themselves upon enslaved women left no names in the birth columns, no acknowledgement of paternity. Their silence is preserved as carefully as their wealth. By contrast, women appear only as categories of utility, their fertility marked, their children tallied, their individuality effaced beneath the language of property. Some records were destroyed outright. In the aftermath of emancipation, planters in certain regions burned or concealed account books, erasing evidence of exploitation before it could be examined. What remains is a partial archive, one shaped not only by time's decay, but by intentional concealment. It is a silence crafted to protect the powerful and to obscure the scale of coercion. The blanks are haunting because they deny descendants a lineage. Generations later, those who turn to the archives in search of family find only fragments. They may encounter a line that reads increase, 1, female, Mother Sally, but never the name of the father whose identity was denied by design. The archive offers half a true, with a genealogy of mothers forced into categories and fathers absent by convenience. Even the surviving records carry distortions. The use of terms like wench or breeding woman dehumanized mothers, reducing them to roles rather than identities. Infants were catalogued as property before they were recognized as children. The ledger became a machine of forgetting, recording enough to sustain ownership, but never enough to acknowledge humanity. To read these blanks is to feel the weight of what was meant to be hidden. The missing names are not oversights, they are the architecture of exploitation itself. They ensured that fathers remained unaccountable, that violence could masquerade as commerce, and that future generations would inherit silence in place of ancestry. In archives, silence is never neutral. The absence of names is evidence of design. The destruction of records is testimony to what they once contained. The gaps, the erasures, the euphemisms, all of them form a shadow archive, one that reveals by omission the truths the system refused to speak. Thus, the ledgers with blanks are not empty, they are filled with intent. Every dash, every omission, every burned page is a record in itself. Proof that what was done was so integral, so systemic, that it could never be admitted in full. What is left behind is a haunting silence, the echo of fathers unnamed, and mothers reduced to words that stripped them of their lives. Not all pregnancies followed the overseer's plan. Beneath the strict surveillance of plantation medicine and within the arithmetic of forced reproduction, enslaved women forged hidden spaces of resistance. Their defiance did not take the form of open rebellion, but of intimate, dangerous acts, methods that sought to reclaim control over their own bodies even when discovery meant punishment or death. Knowledge was one weapon. Across generations, women preserved and shared an understanding of herbs and roots that could act as contraceptives or abortifacients. Cotton root, peacock flower, and other plants became instruments of refusal. These remedies were whispered from mother to daughter, from elder to younger, passed in secrecy within the quarters. To outsiders, they were weeds along the plantation path. To the women, they were lifelines against the arithmetic that sought to turn every womb into capital. At times, resistance took the form of refusal itself. Women who were pressured into reproductive pairing sometimes resisted unions arranged by overseers, turning instead to relationships of their own choosing. Such defiance carried risks, punishment, separation, even sale, but it asserted autonomy where none was meant to exist. The nursery, intended by enslavers to be a site of expansion, could also become a site of interruption. Infanticide, too, appears in the historical record, acts of ultimate desperation. In scattered accounts, women chose to deny the system its increase, ending the lives of infants rather than surrendering them to bondage. To the archive, these events are recorded coldly, sometimes framed as crime or loss of property. But beneath the language of the planter's ledger lies a darker truth, that in certain moments, the most radical act of love was to deny a child a life in chains. Communities also acted in quiet solidarity. Midwives, compelled to see, were as overseers of reproduction, sometimes aided women in these acts of resistance. A midwife could prolong a labor, disguise a miscarriage, or share remedies in secret. Other women provided cover, creating alibis when pregnancies failed to meet the overseer's expectations. These collective acts, fragile and concealed, reveal that resistance was not only individual, but communal. What emerges from these fragments is a portrait of defiance that is subdued but profound. Enslaved women resisted not in grand declarations, but in whispered knowledge, in stolen choices, in refusals that interrupted the arithmetic of profit. Their resistance did not dismantle the system, but it unsettled its smooth machinery, reminding enslavers that bodies could not be reduced entirely to yield. The overseers recorded numbers of births, tallied increase, and boasted of breeding capacity. Yet those numbers never tell the whole story. Behind them lay a field of choices hidden from the ledger, miscarriages that were not accidents, children never born, pregnancies that ended before they could be converted into property. Each absence is itself a kind of presence, a mark of agency within the suffocating control of slavery. Not all pregnancies followed the overseer's plan. Some ended in silence, some never began, and some carried defiance in their very interruption. These acts of resistance, fragile yet enduring, testify that even within the nursery, a place enslavers imagined as their surest foundation, there remained the possibility of refusal. Freedom ended slavery, not its genetic legacy. In 1865, emancipation broke chains and scattered coffles, but it did not restore names erased from ledgers, nor did it mend the genealogies cut apart by sale and silence. What followed was not clarity, but fragmentation. Families sought to reconstruct themselves, yet they did so within records still marked by omission, and within bloodlines that carried patterns of coercion no document could fully explain. In Freedmen's Bureau reports, countless petitions testify to this struggle. Mothers appealed for the recognition of children whose fathers had never been named in law. Men came forward to claim kin, they had been forbidden to acknowledge under slavery. Siblings searched for each other across counties and states, often with nothing but fragments of memory. The archive records their efforts with bureaucratic detachment, claims denied, father unknown, no evidence sufficient. Even in freedom, the blanks remained. Paternity was perhaps the deepest wound. For generations, fathers had been unnamed in plantation books, omitted by design. After emancipation, that silence could not be undone. Children grew into adults with no official record of lineage, and descendants faced the same void when tracing ancestry. The absence of paternal acknowledgement was not only a personal loss, but a structural inheritance. It was the continuation of erasure under a new order. The effort to rebuild families often collided with economic necessity. Formerly enslaved women seeking to protect their children entered contracts that tied them once again to plantations. Men, desperate to reunite households, discovered that separation and sale had dispersed their kin beyond reach. The census recorded freed people as free, yet the columns still lacked the names that slavery had denied. The paper trail of emancipation is filled with fragments, not whole. Ines. Meanwhile, the genetic legacy endured in silence. The skew established during slavery, the disproportionate European male and African female ancestry, did not vanish with freedom. It continued, carried in the inheritance of those born after emancipation. The genome, like the archive, preserved the asymmetry, but without offering resolution. Descendants inherited not only freedom, but the biological residue of generations of coercion. Historians of the period describe emancipation as both liberation and rupture. The moment of freedom did not repair the damage of erasure. Families remained untallied, fathers unnamed, genealogies incomplete. Even as freed people built schools, churches, and communities, they carried within them the silences of what had been denied. The archival record lingers with this contradiction. Emancipated individuals standing before courts and officials, free in law, yet still constrained by the absence of names, the absence of acknowledgement. What emancipation revealed is the persistence of silence. Freedom ended slavery, but it could not restore what had been deliberately destroyed. The ledgers remained blank where fathers should have been, and the genome carried its quiet asymmetries forward. The untallied remained untallied, not because they did not exist, but because the system that erased them had succeeded too thoroughly. Thus, the aftermath of emancipation is not a conclusion, but a haunting continuation. Freedom opened the door, but behind it stood absence itself. Unanswered questions, lost names, and lineages that remain suspended between record and silence. Archives end with blank lines. Genetics ends with error bars. Both speak in the language of incompletion, one by silence, the other by uncertainty. The plantation ledger breaks off mid-page, its ink fading where a name should have been written. The genetic chart concludes with probabilities, shaded intervals that acknowledge what cannot be fixed with certainty. Together, they mark the boundary of what can be known, a frontier of truth suspended between fragments and estimates. Historians who open the surviving ledgers find rows of infants listed only as increase, mothers reduced to wenches, fathers omitted entirely. The handwriting pauses, then stops. What happened beyond the final entry is unknown. Entire lives vanish between one column and the next. The archive, though thick with paper, preserves absence as deliberately as it preserves fact. Its blank spaces are not accidents. They are the shape of power, the architecture of erasure. Geneticists, by contrast, chart their findings in ratios and intervals. The genome confirms patterns, the skew of European male and African female ancestry, the timing of admixture pulses in the slavery era. But it does so with error bars. A figure of 20% may in truth be 18 or 22. The data is certain enough to reveal structure, yet never precise enough to restore individuals. The genome remembers, but it remembers statistically. Each confidence interval is an admission. The past can be approached, but never fully reached. Here, at the intersection of the archive and the genome, the story closes not with resolution, but with ambiguity. Both sources gesture toward the same truth. Systemic coercion shaped reproduction under slavery. Yet neither can deliver a complete ledger. One refuses to name, the other cannot. The result is a haunting chorus of silence and probability, an unfinished record that resists finality. For descendants, this ambiguity is more than academic. It is the lived reality of genealogies that fracture mid-branch, of ancestry reports that suggest but cannot confirm, of family stories that end in ellipses. To search the past is to encounter both blank lines and error margins, to feel history as both undeniable and unknowable. This unresolved quality carries its own weight. It is a reminder that some truths are preserved not in clarity but in shadow. The blank page and the shaded interval are not empty. They are testimonies to the violence that ensured the record would never be whole. They tell us that the system succeeded not only in exploitation, but in leaving absence as its inheritance. Thus the story ends, where certainty dissolves. The ledger, unfinished, is a silence carved into paper. The genome, unresolved, is a probability inscribed in blood. Between them lies the evidence of lives lived under domination, and of generations who carry their echoes without complete knowledge of origin. The final entry is not a conclusion but a pause, an open space where history refuses closure and where the confidence interval becomes the last haunting measure of what remains unseen.